My name is Logan Ward. I am 38 years old, and I serve as a technical captain in the United States Army. I have spent over 15 years managing and maintaining the critical communication networks that keep our bases operational, often working long nights and early mornings while others slept soundly. That morning, I was leaning over a console in the heart of the Network Operations Center, reviewing system logs and tracking unusual activity when a young second lieutenant named Harris walked in, Red Bull in hand, with the kind of swagger that only comes from 6 months of experience and a promotion that felt undeserved. He waved the can toward me with a smirk and suggested I head home, that he had everything under control, as if I were just an observer rather than the person who had built this network from scratch. I paused for a moment, looking up at him over the rim of my glasses, and said nothing. I had learned long ago that the kind of people who talk loudly often have the least understanding of what really keeps the system alive. Harris nodded at me with that casual, rehearsed confidence, probably expecting me to step aside, and for a brief moment, I felt that familiar tug of frustration at being overlooked, as if all my years of dedication could be erased by a well-placed smile and a handful of buzzwords. The control room was humming with quiet activity, servers blinking in rhythm like the pulse of a living organism. I watched Harris stride past the consoles, clearly proud of himself, repeating phrases he had read in a briefing or online, convinced that repeating jargon was equivalent to mastery. Meanwhile, I continued my work, fingers flying across the keyboard, resolving issues that nobody else could even recognize as problems. Every packet traced, every corrupted log repaired, every alert silenced was the result of experience and a deep understanding of the system's inner workings, yet none of it mattered to those who valued appearance over substance. Harris might have had the rank on paper, but he lacked the depth of knowledge that comes only from years of blood, sweat, and late nights spent ensuring nothing failed when it mattered most. I didn't look up again. I didn't need to. I had learned to let the system speak for me, and right now, it was telling me that everything was running smoothly, no thanks to the theatrics of the newcomer. I closed my eyes for a second and imagined the network like a fortress, every node a soldier, every firewall a shield, and I, the one quietly defending it all, invisible but essential. The hum of the servers and the occasional beep of an alert were the only acknowledgement I needed, a reminder that I had been right where I belonged all these years. When Harris finally left the room, probably expecting gratitude or acknowledgement for his supposed brilliance, I poured myself a cup of stale coffee and returned to my logs, letting the frustration settle into a kind of bitter amusement. This was my world, built by my hands, maintained by my mind, and despite the arrogance of a newcomer, nothing was going to break it today. I smiled faintly to myself, because the truth was clear. The system didn't care who drank Red Bull or wore new boots. It cared only about competence, and on that morning, competence was still firmly in my corner. For 7 years, I had poured every ounce of my energy into keeping the base's communication network operational, quietly patching vulnerabilities, optimizing protocols, and troubleshooting failures that could have brought critical operations to a halt. I had spent countless nights tracing packet losses, rebuilding compromised nodes, and documenting every procedure with meticulous care, all without fanfare or recognition. I knew that in this environment, the system's uptime spoke louder than any words, but there was a quiet pride in knowing that if a signal got through, it had passed through work I had done. That day, I watched from my console as Colonel Simmons, my superior, strode into a high-level meeting with a folder in hand. Inside, carefully laid out across color-coded diagrams and labeled schematics, was my entire network architecture, the result of years of planning and hands-on problem-solving. Instead of acknowledging my work, he presented it as though it had been created by Second Lieutenant Harris, the young officer recently promoted after only 6 months of service. I could feel a familiar ache settle in my chest, not because the promotion itself mattered, but because the acknowledgement had been stolen, replaced by someone who had the appearance of competence rather than the substance. Harris nodded along with the presentation, smiling as though he had conceived every intricate connection and redundancy plan himself, while the room of senior officers murmured approval at his supposed brilliance. They applauded his confidence, mistaking it for skill, while I sat behind my terminal, invisible and irrelevant despite knowing more about this network than anyone else in that room. I kept my hands on the keyboard, making small corrections and annotations on my own copy, because even without recognition, the system could not fail, not on my watch. There was a bitter irony in seeing my work lauded in someone else's name, and yet it also reinforced something I had learned long ago. The loudest voice is not always the most knowledgeable. I had learned to be patient, to let actions speak louder than words, and to let experience accumulate silently. I watched Harris leave the room, shoulders squared, proud of what he believed was his own genius. Meanwhile, I returned to my tasks, double-checking logs, resolving flagged errors, and reinforcing security measures that others had overlooked. The frustration never left entirely, but it was tempered by a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that without my years of diligence, the network would falter long before the applause ever reached his ears. Even as I monitored systems and adjusted protocols, I reflected on how the military often rewarded appearance and boldness over steady competence and deep knowledge. The lesson was hard but clear. Recognition is fleeting and often undeserved, yet mastery and responsibility endure, whether anyone notices or not. I leaned back for a moment, letting the hum of the servers remind me that my work still mattered. My efforts were invisible to some, but the network didn't care about appearances, it only cared about reliability, and reliability was my signature. In that silence, there was both pain and pride. A reminder that being right quietly can sometimes be more powerful than shouting for attention. I was summoned to a meeting room with no formal notice, just a brief nod and a vague suggestion that I needed to help with knowledge transfer for the newer officers. The request sounded routine, almost benign, but when I returned to my workstation afterward, the change was unmistakable. My name had been removed from the system, all tasks I had owned were reassigned, and dashboards that had once displayed my stewardship now listed vacant slots or the names of officers with far less experience. Every access log I checked reflected the same cold reality. I had been quietly erased. Notifications I had set to monitor critical systems were reassigned without explanation. Emails that previously routed through me were redirected, and even my personal notes, once considered part of the operational documentation, were treated as though they had never existed. The hum of the servers and blinking indicators continued without pause, indifferent to the fact that the person who had built and maintained the system had been removed from its map entirely. I walked past the familiar consoles, feeling the weight of invisibility settle like a shadow across the room. It was a deliberate erasure, subtle and efficient, carried out without confrontation or announcement. The absence of a formal explanation made it sting more than any argument or reprimand ever could. It was the kind of exclusion that left you questioning the value of your contributions, not because they weren't significant, but because no one seemed to care to acknowledge them. Even as I logged back in under my remaining permissions, the stark reality remained. My role had been nullified in the eyes of the system and in the eyes of those in command. The files I had maintained, the processes I had perfected, and the monitoring routines I had built were now reassigned to someone else with far less experience. There was no discussion, no handover beyond the minimal formalities, only the unspoken message that I no longer mattered. Sitting at my console, I realized that this type of removal was more powerful than a public reprimand. It stripped away recognition, it stripped away authority, and it left behind an almost physical emptiness. The network continued to function, the base continued its operations, and to everyone else, it was business as usual. Yet I felt the stark isolation of being erased, present yet invisible, a ghost in the very system I had spent years perfecting. That quiet erasure was a message in itself, and it resonated deeper than any shouted insult ever could. I packed up my personal items with a calm I did not feel inside, knowing that every movement was being watched but leaving nothing to betray my intentions. Before leaving my desk for the final time, I placed a small USB in a concealed drawer, filled with backups of scripts, security protocols, and system maps that only I could interpret. Alongside it, I left a technical guide I had authored, neatly organized and signed, giving the appearance of a routine handoff while secretly embedding instructions that only someone with my experience would understand. Every detail was intentional. Folder structures, file names, and notes carried subtle markers that would reveal their true origin to anyone paying attention, though most would never notice. The code I left behind contained redundancies and annotations designed to guide the network safely while also making it clear who had been responsible for its design. It was a way of leaving a fingerprint on the system without making a scene, a quiet assertion that even in absence, I remained present in control. I glanced around the office one last time, seeing Harris tapping away at a keyboard I had once claimed as my own, blissfully unaware of the messages hidden in plain sight. To anyone else, it looked like I had left everything in order, a professional passing along duties to a colleague. In reality, each file, every snippet of code, was a message that I had been there, that I had built the foundation, and that I could return at any moment with full knowledge of the systems they now tried to claim as theirs. As I walked out, I felt a strange satisfaction, the calm of someone who had set the board for a game that others were too blind to see. It was an assertion of intellect, a subtle statement of permanence, and a reminder that even in invisibility, power can remain. The USB, the annotated code, the signed guides all were pieces of a silent plan, a breadcrumb trail for anyone astute enough to follow. Harris and the officers thought they had taken over, but I had left something far more enduring than my presence. The office lights hummed quietly, servers blinking in their endless rhythm, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding around them. Yet they would remember me, indirectly, through the systems I had left intact and the subtle instructions only I could execute. Leaving was not an admission of defeat, it was a tactical withdrawal, a calculated pause that promised a return on my terms when the time was right. I walked into my apartment that evening, the silence hitting me harder than any confrontation could have. The hum of the city outside contrasted sharply with the emptiness I felt inside, yet there was a strange clarity that came with being alone. I booted up my laptop and began sifting through every piece of information I had access to, starting with emails, system logs, and internal messages that mapped months of activity I had overseen and documented meticulously. Each message and log entry told a story of my work being reassigned without acknowledgement, of protocols I had designed being implemented under someone else's name. I moved on to contracts and internal memoranda, carefully cataloging dates, signatures, and any indication that procedures had been followed or ignored. It didn't take long to see the pattern. Deadlines had been missed, notices of termination for military personnel had not been sent in accordance with federal law, and the window for compliance had been deliberately ignored. The realization struck with both a sharp sting and a peculiar sense of opportunity. I was no longer just a victim of oversight or arrogance. I was armed with evidence and knowledge that could turn the situation to my advantage. I organized the files, labeling each email, log, and screenshot by relevance and date, creating a comprehensive record that could be presented as undeniable proof of procedural failure. Each detail, from the precise timestamp of an email to the sequence of system changes, mattered. It was methodical work, the kind of painstaking attention to detail that had been drilled into me over years of military service. I leaned back and allowed myself a brief moment to reflect. In the military, precision and discipline aren't just guidelines, they are survival. That mindset had carried me through long nights maintaining networks, troubleshooting critical failures, and ensuring the safety of operations. Now it would guide my next steps, not in a physical battlefield, but in one of strategy and law. The sense of control that came from thorough preparation began to replace the earlier shock and frustration. As the hours passed, I continued building the framework for a tactical response. Contracts were cross-referenced with communications, internal protocols were verified against logs, and inconsistencies were noted for legal consultation. My mind, once clouded by the emotional weight of betrayal, became razor-sharp. Each discovery reinforced the fact that the violation was not accidental, but systemic, and it was now my responsibility to respond with equal precision. By the time night fully settled over the city, I had transformed frustration into strategy. The evidence was compiled, organized, and ready. I had moved from being a sidelined officer to someone quietly preparing for the next phase, a position of power disguised as compliance. They may have thought they were erasing me, but I had already turned their oversight into a blueprint for reclaiming control, proving that discipline and careful planning could outweigh arrogance and short-sightedness. In that quiet room, surrounded by my digital and physical records, I realized that being a veteran meant more than experience in operations. It meant understanding when to act, and how to ensure that justice could be served without haste, but without fail. As I combed through my contracts and federal regulations, I stumbled upon a clause that shifted everything. It stated that if a service member were terminated without proper notification in accordance with military law, all legal restrictions tied to their contract, including security obligations and non-compete clauses, would be null and void. The discovery hit me like a calculated strike. What had seemed like a powerless position suddenly became an opportunity to reclaim authority and control. I immediately reached out to a lawyer named Ramsey, a former military officer with years of experience navigating these complex rules. His understanding of both the law and the operational structure meant that he could turn my documentation into a strategic weapon. We began assembling a meticulous file, combining contracts, logs, and correspondence into a coherent record that clearly demonstrated the procedural violations. Every detail mattered. Timestamped emails, reassigned tasks, missed notifications, and system logs were cataloged to show the exact points of failure. The approach was methodical, almost surgical, mirroring the planning and precision I had applied in network operations. It wasn't about revenge. It was about setting the record straight and creating an unassailable foundation for the next move. As the night wore on, I could feel the shift in momentum. What had started as an attempt to marginalize me had now provided the evidence to assert my rights fully. Every omission they had made, every procedure they had ignored, became a potential lever. With Ramsey guiding the legal strategy, I transitioned from passive observation to active control, orchestrating a response with the precision of a coordinated operation. The room felt charged even in silence. My laptop glowed with the files I had gathered, a digital arsenal ready to be deployed. Confidence replaced frustration. The narrative had changed. I was no longer at the mercy of arrogance or oversight. I had identified the weakness, understood the rules, and prepared my counterstrike. This wasn't luck or coincidence. It was the culmination of years of discipline, experience, and attention to detail coming together at exactly the right moment. By the time I leaned back and took a breath, I knew the tides had turned. They had believed that bureaucratic inertia and their assumed authority could silence me. Instead, their oversight had armed me with the tools to reclaim my freedom, and I was ready to execute the plan with patience, precision, and confidence. The morning of the deposition arrived with a calm that belied the tension in the room. I wore my old uniform instead of a suit, a subtle reminder of who I was and where my authority truly came from. Across the table sat Colonel Simmons, 2 military lawyers, and a human resources representative, all expecting a routine session that would affirm their narrative and dismiss my claims. From the very first question, my attorney, Ramsey, moved deliberately, requesting verification of the official notification dates and referencing the procedural standards that had been ignored. Each question was precise, designed to expose the gap between what had been required and what had been delivered. When the evidence of deliberate delay was presented, a series of time-stamped emails, internal memos, and system logs, the room grew quiet, the weight of the documentation sinking in. I observed Simmons, his face tightening, attempting to mask surprise with rehearsed composure. Every time he tried to assert authority, Ramsey countered with undeniable proof of missteps, guiding me to respond only to what was asked and nothing more. It was a performance of control and discipline, a chess game executed in real time, where each piece moved according to a plan I had helped construct through years of careful preparation. The evidence was meticulous, almost surgical. Internal communications showed explicit attempts to delay notifications, reassign tasks, and obscure documentation. The timestamps lined up perfectly with the legal requirements, leaving no room for excuses or improvisation. I felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing the plan had been executed flawlessly and the opponents had walked into a trap they never saw coming. As the deposition continued, Simmons grew more rigid, interjections faltering under the weight of his own mismanagement. The lawyers on the other side whispered among themselves, eyes darting to check the records presented on our side. Every display of confidence they tried to muster was eroded by the factual evidence, and each attempt to regain control only reinforced the precision of our preparation. I sat back, calm and measured, letting the documents and testimony speak for themselves. This was not about shouting or dramatics. It was about the quiet authority that comes from being prepared, from understanding the system inside out, and from knowing the rules better than anyone else. By the time the session ended, the narrative had shifted entirely, the momentum unmistakably in my favor. Even after the gavel fell, the sense of victory was subtle but absolute. They had thought they could erase me, intimidate me, and claim the systems and authority I had built. Instead, their arrogance and oversight had provided the path to expose every misstep, and I had followed it with patience, precision, and unflinching calm. The battle was over, but the lesson remained clear. Preparation, discipline, and strategic thinking can turn even the most confident adversaries into unwitting participants in their own undoing. After the deposition, the story began to spread quietly at first, through a blog maintained by a group of veterans who tracked issues in military administration. Their posts detailed the events, the evidence, and the remarkable precision with which the situation had been handled. Within hours, larger news outlets picked it up, framing it as an unprecedented case of procedural failure and accountability, highlighting the exact dates, logs, and legal clauses that had been overlooked. Even lawmakers took notice. A few members of Congress began discussing amendments to federal regulations to prevent similar oversights for other service members. The story became a touchpoint for reform, a real-world example of how individual action could reveal systemic weaknesses and inspire change. While all this unfolded, I remained silent. I had no intention of turning the situation into personal fame. My goal was simple: to reclaim the respect and authority that had been stripped away and to ensure that the truth could not be ignored. Sitting back in my apartment, I watched the responses roll in, quietly noting the reach of each article, the discussions it sparked online, and the subtle reverberations through military channels. It was a strange sort of satisfaction, one that came not from recognition but from knowing that preparation, patience, and adherence to principles could have consequences far beyond the immediate room. Others saw a legal victory. I saw evidence that careful, disciplined action could influence even the most rigid institutions. The hum of my laptop became a rhythm to match the calm confidence I felt, a reminder that real power does not need to announce itself. In the days that followed, messages came from former colleagues, veterans who had witnessed similar injustices but never had the chance or the proof to act. Their gratitude and quiet acknowledgement reinforced that my efforts were meaningful, not just for myself, but for anyone who might face similar circumstances in the future. I remained in the background, focused on my own path, letting the impact of the story unfold organically. It was a reminder that sometimes change does not come from noise or spectacle, but from silent, deliberate action executed with clarity and purpose. The realization settled over me like a quiet dawn. One person, working methodically and without seeking applause, could expose the truth and create meaningful change. That lesson, simple but profound, would guide every step I took in the future, a testament to the power of disciplined patience and strategic thinking. I officially left the Army that morning, stepping out without the weight of a uniform or the insignia of rank. The freedom was immediate and profound, a sensation I had not felt in years of service, long days, and endless responsibilities. I transitioned into a role as a technology consultant for a nonprofit focused on assisting veterans, a position that allowed me to build, guide, and innovate without the constraints of bureaucracy or rigid hierarchy. Each day, I approached my work with the same precision I had learned in the military, but now it was infused with purpose and choice rather than obligation. I designed systems, trained teams, and created solutions that directly impacted the lives of those who had given so much, quietly making a difference without seeking recognition. The contrast was stark. There was no need to defend my position, no orders to follow blindly, only the satisfaction of knowing my work mattered on its own terms. For the first time in years, I felt fully autonomous, able to shape my own path while still contributing to something larger than myself. The lessons of patience, strategy, and discipline that had carried me through challenges now guided my efforts in ways that were rewarding and tangible. I realized that leaving the uniform behind did not diminish my identity or my purpose. It amplified it, opening a space where I could build freely, innovate boldly, and finally move forward without constraint.